Once upon a time, in the depths of an ancient forest, stood a solitary cabin made of weathered wood and covered in ivy. Its windows glowed faintly, casting an otherworldly light on the surrounding mist and dark trees. Rumors among the locals spoke of strange figures moving within the cabin, hinting at its supernatural inhabitants. Many dared not to approach, fearing the secrets hidden within the walls. Local children whispered of ghostly whispers drifting from the cabin and strange lights flickering in the night. Some claimed to have seen shadows moving past the windows, while others swore they heard a soft, mournful weeping coming from within the darkened building. Rumors circulated that the cabin had been the site of a tragic event long ago, and the spirits of those who met their fate there still lingered, trapped within the walls. Over the years, those brave enough to venture near the cabin spoke of an eerie presence, a feeling of being watched, as if unseen eyes observed from behind the wooden planks. Some claimed that the cabin seemed to draw them closer, as if it had a mind of its own. Many who dared to linger near the structure found themselves feeling the cold presence of the supernatural, as if stepping too close to it could awaken some malevolent force. In recent months, the eerie presence around the cabin had become more intense. The shadows within seemed to move with more purpose, the whispers grew louder, and the feeling of being watched intensified. Reports of strange sightings and unusual sounds in the forest surrounding the cabin had increased, lending credence to the tales of the supernatural. The area around the cabin had become increasingly ominous. Locals spoke of hearing strange noises like footsteps and eerie laughter echoing through the forest in the dead of night. Some reported seeing wisps of mist moving unnaturally around the cabin, as if they were drawn to a mysterious energy within. Rumors circulated of a powerful presence that was slowly awakening, its malevolent aura spilling out into the forest and surrounding the cabin like a dark shroud. In the recent months, reports of local pets mysteriously disappearing had been on the rise. Dogs, cats, and even livestock had vanished without a trace, and the fear and uncertainty had spread throughout the community. Animal owners whispered of strange happenings near the cabin, as if something was luring their beloved companions into the darkness. Rumors circulated that the disappearances were linked to the cabin, as if whatever malevolent force resided within was drawing the creatures closer. Some locals spoke in hushed tones of strange lights flickering in the forest at night, and eerie shadows prowling the undergrowth. They speculated that the creatures were being drawn into a trap, lured by the cabin's mysterious power, and disappearing into its dark embrace. One fateful day, the town's worst fears came true. A person, a local resident who had been reported missing, had vanished near the cabin. Search parties combed the forest, but no trace of them could be found. Whispers of malevolent spirits and supernatural beings grew louder, as the community struggled to understand what dark force had taken hold in their midst. As the search for the missing person continued, more residents began to speak of strange sensations, like the feeling of being watched from the shadows of the forest. Some claimed to hear ghostly voices whispering their names, while others reported seeing shadowy figures darting between the trees. The fear and tension in the town escalated, as the cabin seemed to hold an even tighter grip over the community. Alongside reports of the missing person and the supernatural happenings, whispers of lingering fog drifted through the town, Local residents spoke of a thick, unnaturally cold fog that persisted throughout the day, as if it were being kept in place by some unseen force. The fog grew denser near the cabin, lending credence to the legends of its supernatural qualities and the malevolent entities trapped within. In a shocking turn of events, another person went missing, this time significantly further away from the cabin. Despite the increased distance, the mysterious disappearance only fueled the rumors and fears that the cabin's influence extended far beyond its immediate surroundings. The townsfolk grew more alarmed, speculating that the malevolent presence was growing stronger and spreading its dark reach further into the surrounding area. As the townsfolk banded together to organize watches over the cabin, they could not shake the feeling of being watched as they kept guard. The shadows of the forest seemed to move in the periphery of their vision, and strange noises echoed through the trees, as if unseen eyes were observing them from the darkness. Doubt and fear began to spread among the watchers, as they realized they may have underestimated the true extent of the cabin's mysterious power. As the watches continued, the feeling of being watched became more intense. Flickering lights danced at the edge of the forest, like ghostly eyes watching the groups of townspeople gathered at the cabin's perimeter. Some of the watchers reported seeing shadows shifting and darting between the trees, as if the supernatural beings within the cabin were testing their resolve. The townsfolk grew more on edge, whispers of dark forces and malevolent spirits circulating through the community. After their shifts guarding the cabin, the watchers would find themselves plagued by intense nightmares about the cabin. In their dreams, they would see themselves trapped within its wooden walls, feeling their souls being prodded and examined by unseen forces. The nightmares were vivid and harrowing, leaving the watchers disturbed and questioning the extent of the cabin's influence on their very souls. As the nightmares continued, the watch group slowly diminished as many of the participants began to grow weary of the intense dreams. The nightmares were becoming more frequent and more troubling, and some of the watchers began to feel as though their souls were being consumed by the cabin's dark power. The townsfolk grew more isolated, unable to shake the feeling of being stalked by something otherworldly. Word of the cabin's strange happenings spread, drawing the attention of professional spirit chasers and paranormal investigators. Rumors of supernatural phenomena and malevolent forces within the cabin had reached their ears, and they were eager to explore the mysterious dwelling. They believed they would be immune to the cabin's influence, as they had experience in dealing with otherworldly entities. As the paranormal investigators entered the town, they were immediately struck by the intense presence that surrounded the area. The air felt heavy and charged with energy, and a sense of foreboding settled over them. They could feel the cabin's influence seeping into the very fabric of the town, and they knew they were walking into something extraordinary. The investigators felt a strange mixture of excitement and unease as they approached the cabin. The surrounding forest seemed to watch their every move, as if the trees themselves were alive and aware of their presence. The cabin loomed ahead, its dark silhouette outlined against the misty sky, beckoning them closer with a silent, malicious aura. After the arrival of the paranormal investigators, the town started experiencing additional strange happenings. Food began to decay at an alarming rate, as if some otherworldly force was trying to disrupt the town's supplies. Objects were found moved and arranged in strange patterns, and a low, constant rumble could be heard from deep within the forest, as if the spirits were warning the townsfolk to stay away. As if the strange events weren't enough, the townsfolk soon found themselves cut off from the outside world as communications broke down and severe weather conditions closed off the roads. In the midst of the supernatural happenings, they were now isolated, trapped in a town held in the grip of some mysterious force. With communications down and the roads blocked, the townsfolk grew more desperate. The feeling of being trapped increased, as they realized they had no way to contact the outside world and ask for help. The weather seemed to intensify, as if the forces at work were trying to keep them locked within the town's boundaries. The paranormal investigators found themselves in a peculiar situation. Their equipment was detecting off-the-chart readings, indicating that they were indeed in the presence of something supernatural. However, they feared that whatever otherworldly force was at work in the cabin didn't want outsiders to disturb its hold on the town. As the investigators delved deeper into the paranormal activity surrounding the cabin, they began to realize that they were not dealing with a simple haunting. They could sense a malevolent, otherworldly force at play. A force that had the ability to manipulate more than just objects and dreams. They started to fear that they were becoming pawns in a much larger, more sinister game. The next day, the paranormal investigators observed a strange silence that had set in over the town. It seemed as though everyone had disappeared, leaving only themselves and the looming presence of the haunted cabin. The absence of people only heightened the sense of isolation and unease that already permeated the area. As the investigators searched for the missing townspeople, they stumbled upon a shocking discovery. They found the entire population of the town in a deep, unnatural sleep, as if they had been entranced or put under a spell. The investigators were left dumbfounded, unsure of what force was at work to cause such a bizarre state to befall the townspeople. Alongside the strange sleeping situation, the investigators noticed a peculiar anomaly. Time seemed to be moving much faster than normal. Food decayed at an alarming rate, and the seasons appeared to be shifting rapidly. This only added to the growing list of bizarre events unfolding in the town, leaving the investigators puzzled and more unnerved by the minute. Disturbing events. The investigators continued to observe the sleeping townspeople, and a strange realization dawned upon them. Not only were the people unnaturally asleep, but they also appeared to be frozen in time. The watches on their wrists had stopped, and there was no sign of aging or movement. It was as if the entire town was trapped in a moment, held in the grip of some malevolent force. As the investigators observed the frozen townspeople, they suddenly realized a startling fact. While the townsfolk appeared to be frozen in time, they themselves were aging rapidly. It was as if some otherworldly force was accelerating time for them specifically, as if trying to push them away from the town. The investigators knew they needed to find a way to escape before the time distortions overtook them completely. The investigators began to research the history of the town and the cabin, trying to understand what had started these strange occurrences. They discovered that the cabin had been standing for centuries, and reports of supernatural activity had come and gone over the years. There had been many whispered tales and local legends about the cabin, but nothing substantial to explain the events unfolding now. However, the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind these developments was ancient and powerful beyond measure. As the investigators delved deeper into the town's history, they stumbled upon a shocking discovery. It appeared that two of the residents had recently discussed plans to demolish the cabin and build a new house on the site. This revelation piqued the investigators' interest, as it could be a motive for the supernatural activity. The investigators speculated that the malevolent force present in the cabin would not take kindly to the destruction of its home. The investigators' research into the town's history continued to bear fruit, and they discovered a crucial piece of information. The two residents who had recently gone missing were, in fact, the new people in town. What was even more startling was that they had been the ones to discuss plans to demolish the cabin. The investigators began to see a darker motive behind the disappearances, and realized that the supernatural force may have been targeting the newcomers for their plans to destroy its home. As the investigators connected the dots between the missing residents and the discussions about demolishing the cabin, a chilling realization dawned upon them. They too were newcomers to the town, just like the vanished individuals. A sense of dread washed over them as they began to suspect that they might be the next target for the malevolent force. The investigators' sense of dread grew stronger by the minute. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being closely watched and that the malevolent force was now turning its attention towards them. The town seemed even more ominous now, and every shadow seemed to hold a sinister secret. Despite their extensive experience in dealing with the supernatural, the investigators couldn't shake the feeling that they were out of their depth in this situation. The investigators found themselves in a terrible predicament. They were unable to leave the town as the roads were still closed off by the extreme weather, and they could not stay, as they were likely targets for the malevolent force. They were trapped within the confines of the town, at the mercy of the supernatural presence and the bizarre happenings that continued to unfold around them. The investigators' fear intensified as they noticed that time was now moving even faster than before. They could see the seasons changing rapidly outside the windows, and the days seemed to fly by in a flash. They realized that if this rapid passage of time continued, it would mean their doom. The investigators were acutely aware that they were running out of time to find a way out of this dire situation. As the passage of time continued to accelerate, the investigators could not believe the changes in themselves. One of the older members of the group had aged rapidly, now looking like a man in his 90s. The investigators knew that if the rapid aging continued, their very lives were at stake, and they needed to find a solution to this supernatural phenomenon as quickly as they could. The investigators were hit hard by the death of their colleague, but what was even more puzzling was that his body had not decomposed in any way. He still looked exactly as he did when they first came to the town. The investigators were left utterly bewildered, grappling with the knowledge that not only was time accelerating, but the natural laws of life and death seemed to have been thrown into disarray. As the investigators witnessed the strange phenomenon of their colleague's unchanging body, they were struck by a grim realization. Because they were significantly younger than their colleague, they would have to endure the bizarre time distortions and rapid aging for even longer. The implications of this realization were terrifying, and the investigators began to question what other horrors they might face in their prolonged stay in the cursed town. The investigators noticed a strange change in the cabin's surroundings as time and weather continued to morph. It appeared that the supernatural forces holding sway over the area were becoming increasingly agitated, as if the constant change and distortion were weakening its power. The temperature began to fluctuate wildly, and the air felt charged with energy, as if the malevolent entity was losing its grip on the town. In a glimmer of hope, the investigators noticed that time seemed to be slowing down again. This shift in pace offered a fleeting sense of relief, as they clung to the possibility that the supernatural forces might be weakening. However, the investigators knew that even the smallest ray of hope could be deceptive, and they remained cautious. The investigators began to understand the nature of the malevolent forces within the cabin. They realized that the supernatural entity was feeding off the life energy of the town's residents. Could this be the reason why time had accelerated and why the townsfolk had fallen into a deep, unnatural sleep? Without wasting any time, the investigators dove into research of the town's history, desperate to learn more about the people who had once lived there. They scoured old documents, newspapers, and historical records, searching for clues that could help them understand the supernatural entity and its connection to the town's inhabitants. As the investigators delved deeper into the town's history, they stumbled upon something unexpected. They found documents and records that dated back over 100 years, and among them they noticed occasional images that seemed eerily familiar. The investigators could sense that they had stumbled upon something significant, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it yet. As the investigators studied the images, a chilling realization began to dawn upon them. The people depicted in the old photographs were an uncanny resemblance to the current townsfolk. It didn't make sense. The images were over 100 years old. How could the people look so similar to those still living in the town today? The investigators, determined to uncover answers, began a search of the town's houses. They scoured through drawers and cabinets, looking for any documentation or photographs that could shed light on the baffling situation. Their primary goal was to find birth certificates or more recent images that might reveal the truth behind the uncanny resemblance between the people depicted in the old photographs and the current townsfolk. The investigators' search led them to an alarming discovery. They found a series of birth certificates that matched the current townsfolk, but these certificates were dated from well over a century ago. The implications were terrifying. It was as if the people in the town were somehow existing outside the natural order of time. The investigators attempted to wake one of the sleeping townspeople, but they found themselves even more bewildered than before. As they tried to rouse the person, they noticed a strange effect on the person's watch. It seemed to speed forward, almost as if time were accelerating again. This further cemented the strange and unnatural hold that time and space had over the town and its inhabitants. The investigators were beginning to understand the nature of the supernatural phenomenon they were dealing with. It seemed that the townspeople were indeed trapped in a loop of time, with the malevolent spirit feeding off their life energy. The cabin itself was most likely a nexus for this energy, acting as a conduit through which the entity could manipulate the fabric of reality. The investigators made a further disturbing realization. The townspeople's deep sleep had rendered them unable to provide enough life energy for the malevolent spirit to feed upon. As a result, the spirit's power was gradually waning. The investigators found themselves considering a difficult question. If the spirit were to die, would that mean that the townspeople would wake up, only to begin aging rapidly and face the fate of passing away? It was a cruel situation. The very thing keeping the townsfolk alive was also their ultimate doom. With the weakening supernatural power, the investigators seized the opportunity. They recognized that now was the time to take action and approach the cabin more easily. They knew they had to find a way to stop or destroy the cabin, as it was the source of the entire supernatural phenomenon. The investigators understood that even if the townsfolk were to die, it was natural for them, considering their prolonged existence. They had been trapped in a timeless loop for so long, and now their life energy had been drained by the entity. It was the cabin that had halted the natural course of aging, keeping them alive and captive in this eerie predicament. The investigators pondered the question of whether the spirit, in its weakened state, had lost the ability to wake up the townspeople. If the spirit's power was indeed waning, it was possible that it had become more difficult for it to maintain the townsfolk in their current state of sleep and unnatural stasis. However, the investigators were wary. It was unclear how much power the spirit did or didn't have at this point. The investigators suddenly had a light bulb moment. They began to consider whether the spirit had not fully comprehended the consequences of putting the entire town to sleep en masse. Had it failed to predict that this action would ultimately reduce the life energy it fed on, thereby weakening itself in the process? If this was indeed the case, the spirit might have unwittingly set in motion a cycle of its own demise. The investigators were facing a risky dilemma. If they allowed the townsfolk to wake up as the spirit's hold on them weakened, would the spirit regain its power and unleash some even more terrifying force upon them? It was a gamble. Either they let the townsfolk awaken, hoping that the spirit was too weak to retaliate, or they allowed the townsfolk to remain asleep, prolonging their unnatural existence. Both options held their own risks and uncertainties. The investigators had to carefully consider their next move. It was clear to the investigators that there was no other way. The cabin had to be destroyed as quickly as possible. The malevolent spirit's influence had taken a stranglehold over the entire town, and the only way to break its power was to eliminate its source. But how to do it? The investigators knew that any attempt to destroy the cabin would likely rouse the spirit from its current weakened state, and they had to prepare for the worst. The investigators, lacking any expertise in explosives, managed to find some old mining explosive. With a mix of caution and determination, they painstakingly rigged the charge as best they could, their lack of experience adding an extra layer of uncertainty to their actions. They knew the explosive would be powerful, but they also knew that they were taking a huge risk by using it inside the cabin. The investigators had reached the moment of truth. They triggered the charge, and it detonated with a loud explosion. However, they had unwittingly used too much explosive, causing far more damage to the cabin than they had anticipated. The force of the explosion shook the very foundations of the building, and it was clear that the blast had been much more powerful than they had intended. In an instant, the investigators found themselves caught in the massive explosion they had triggered. Time seemed to slow as they experienced a split moment that felt like an eternity. In that moment, they saw the cabin utterly destroyed, and as the dust settled, the entire town was nowhere to be seen. The investigators opened their eyes with a start, discovering that the cabin and the town were still very much present. Even more bizarrely, the townsfolk slowly emerged from their houses, as if roused from their long and unnatural sleep. The investigators found themselves disoriented and confused, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. As the investigators took in their surroundings, they noticed something peculiar. The townsfolk, while appearing normal on the surface, seemed to know the investigators by name. This was strange because the investigators were newcomers to the town, so it was unusual that the townsfolk would have any knowledge of them. The investigators, as they continued their inspection, spotted something unusual with their watches. The dates displayed on them indicated a time almost 50 years into the future, which utterly baffled them. How could time have leapt forward so drastically? Could this be some sort of side effect of their failed attempt to destroy the cabin? The investigators' realization dawned upon them like a thunderbolt. They had come to understand that they had been trapped in some kind of temporal loop for the past 50 years. The explosion they had experienced must have triggered their deaths, providing the malevolent spirit with the pure energy it so desperately craved. The investigators now knew that they were pawns in the spirit's sinister plan, doomed to relive the same cycle over and over. As the investigators tried to come to terms with the shocking revelation that they had been trapped in a temporal loop for the past 50 years, they felt a cold sense of dread wash over them. They were now aware that their repeated deaths had only served to feed the malevolent spirit, strengthening its hold over the town. The investigators were left to wonder, how could they break this cyclical nightmare and free themselves from this timeless prison? The investigators were plunged into a deep despair as they realized that there was no escape from this endless cycle. They were resigned to the cruel truth that they would be trapped in this time-dilated nightmare for all eternity, their deaths perpetually fueling the malevolent force that had ensnared the town.